Which leads me very nicely into my next guest, who identified the bones of Richard III in a Leicester car park and raised eyebrows when she took on the task of analysing Hitler's DNA. This is not a woman that shies away from bold things, I would say. Turi King, world-renowned geneticist, professor, director of the Milner Centre for Evolution at the University of Bath, and is here in my studio to talk about her new book. It's called The Secrets of Our DNA, How Genetics Has Changed the World. Turi, good morning.
Good morning.
Are you naturally just bold?
Well, I don't shy away from a challenge, which you probably saw with the Hitler case. So this was one where I completely agonized over doing it because I knew it would be big. But then I started thinking about, you know what, he's one of the most studied men in history. And this is just another layer of information that we can add to what we know about him. And obviously when we do the work, we completely caveat it about how, the genetics is not diagnostic. He did not act on his own. I mean, obviously, the really big thing is about not stigmatizing people with particular conditions.
Yeah, you don't want someone to have a condition. You say, well, Hitler had that. So
exactly.
That type.
And you can't say that from the DNA.
Your job is very similar to journalism. You have to put kind of your own personal views to one side. And with science, as with journalism, you have to just go, here are the facts, make of it what you will, and present it so it's interesting and accessible. When you were finding stuff out, did that ever taint your kind of thinking?
Well, okay, so, we had no idea what we were going to find. And so, of course, there were things in there that we just kind of think, oh, my goodness.
And for anyone who didn't know, how did you get hold of the DNA?
So this actually came through a production company called Blink Films, who contacted me and said, we think we might have access to Hitler's DNA. So my first question, of course, is, okay, wait a minute, is it actually his DNA? We need to authenticate this. So you have to go through the entire process about where's this from? And we know that Hitler killed himself on a sofa in the Führer bunker in the last days of the war, and he bleeds on his sofa. And a chap called Roswell P. Rosengren, who is Eisenhower's public information officer, is one of the few men who's allowed into the bunker after the war. And you can imagine it, it's young men, the war is over. What does he start to do? He takes souvenirs, so like a waste paper basket and papers, and he cuts a swatch out of the sofa where Hitler killed himself, and there's blood on it. And it's kept in the family for decades, and then it is sold to a museum, and that's being made available. So it's all the authentication is things like, does this fabric look like it actually comes from the sofa? We've got pictures of that sofa. Does the DNA look like it's old? And then what we were able to do is match the DNA against a male line relative of Hitler's, and the match was incredibly rare. And then you have to kind of go, okay, but could it have been any other of Hitler's male line relatives who managed to get into the bunker, go over to the sofa and bleed on it? And once you do all of that, you can be pretty happy that it is his DNA. And then it's doing the whole genome sequencing of that.
What does DNA tell you? I know this sounds like a very simplistic and stupid question, but what exactly does it tell me?
So that is a really, really important question, and something that I hope really comes out in the book, what it can tell you and what it can't tell you. So Hitler's actually quite an interesting case in this one because there's a lot of historical documentation which talks about his genitalia being underdeveloped. And we found that he has a deletion in a particular gene that we know is associated with underdeveloped genitalia.
So when you say associated, does it mean you would have underdeveloped genitalia?
No. So that's really important. So we know that this is a gene that is associated with genital development. So people will be on a spectrum in terms of what the deletion is and where it is in a particular gene, how that affects you. So that's a really important thing. Even though we know that he has a deletion in a gene that we know is strongly associated with genital underdevelopment, the DNA can't tell us what Hitler's genitals look like. And I can't believe I'm saying this on national radio.
No, it's fantastic. Because this is what... No, look, we're doing a science club at 12 o'clock. Yeah. This is the stuff that draws you in.
Absolutely.
To understand DNA.
Yeah.
Because, that phrase, it's in her DNA, it's in their DNA.
Yeah, which as a geneticist makes me kind of squirm a little bit.
Bonkers.
Yeah. So your DNA can tell you whether or not you're genetically predisposed towards a condition. So there are some genetic variants where it's like, you have that, yes, you will go on to develop that particular condition. But we also know that there's so many conditions where it's polygenic and that your genetic makeup is only a small part of it. So it could be something where there are conditions where there are numerous little genetic variants that will either predispose you towards or against a particular condition. But then it's you and your environment. That's everything that's kind of not genetics. Nature through nurture. So nature being the genetics and nurture basically being everything else. And you're a combination of your genetic makeup and everything else that kind of happens to you, but also what you do. So for example, if you smoke or if you get enough exercise, all of that kind of stuff is going to affect your health. It's fascinating stuff. I hope it really comes out in the book that I just absolutely love the power of genetics, but also that we have to be careful about what we can and cannot tell from it.
I'm fascinated. There's always this thing that you can cheat science when science first emerges. It's at the start of the book where you talk about a case where someone got someone else to give a sample.
Yeah.
And it was a crime case. And just how that was found out.
I love that story because obviously it's one of the reasons why I ended up going to the University of Leicester to learn genetics. So this is Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys. He is the inventor of DNA fingerprinting, and it's the very first forensic case. So people, when they hear about DNA fingerprinting, DNA profiling, they do think about the forensic cases. And one of the stories I talk about is actually the first time it's ever used was actually in an immigration case, which was really interesting. But this was a case, so these were two girls, 1983 and 1986, Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann, each separately raped and murdered in villages near to Leicester. And the modus operandi made it look like there must be somebody who knows the area. They're found on footpaths, this sort of thing. So you have to know the area. And a chap called David Baker had heard about Alec Jeffreys and DNA profiling. And so he asked him to have a look at this case. Dawn Ashworth was the girl who was killed in 1986. And there was a lad he kind of seemed to know where Dawn was going to be found before the police actually found her. And so they brought him in. And under questioning, he admitted to Dawn's murder, but not to Linda's murder. And so David went to Alec and said, look, could you do the DNA and just see whether or not it's this lad who's done it? And it turned out, no, he hadn't done either of these. So the first time that DNA fingerprinting was actually used was actually to exonerate somebody. The chap who'd actually done it was a chap called Colin Pitchfork. And what happened was they did this giant DNA dragnet. So you've got David Baker's like, right, we're going to try and get DNA samples from all the men kind of between the ages of 15 and 40 who live in these villages. And we'll see if we can kind of flush out the individual. But he knew that whoever did it might try and avoid getting their DNA tested. And Colin Pitchfork got a colleague at work called Ian Kelly to do the DNA test for him. And Ian happened to be out with mates at a pub just across the park from where Alec's lab is. And he let slip to a colleague that, I went and did a DNA test for Colin. And one of his workmates realized the implication of this.
Because he'd been asked as well.
Yeah. So they went to the police. They arrested both Colin and Ian on the same day. And even as he was being arrested, Colin is admitting to the crimes. And he's still in jail to this day.
It just shows, doesn't it, that human nature can interfere.
Oh, absolutely.
With DNA. I mean, there's a quote you talk about in one of your chapters. You say there's a certain aura around DNA. It's portrayed as the silver bullet, which provides definitive proof in a forensic case. Numerous crime dramas depict genetic evidence as the plot twist, don't they? The evidence on which the prosecution or defence case hinges. And you say, I often hear the phrase, DNA doesn't lie. It's true. It's just that, you say, as in any other conversation, you need to take what the DNA is saying in context.
Absolutely.
So you still need humans. You know what I mean?
So it really came to the fore in my career with the Richard III case. We find the remains, and it's basically a historical missing persons case. So Richard III, killed in 1485 in battle. We know from historical documentation that he's buried in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars. Shakespeare famously writes about him as a bunched-back toad. So we're looking for somebody possibly with a spinal abnormality. We have to be careful with that because Shakespeare is writing in the Tudor period, and they're never going to say, Richard III was lovely and we killed him so that we could come to the throne. So there is a historical document which talks about him having one shoulder higher than the other, so possibly a spinal abnormality in there. So we find the remains, and this is where the really hard work comes in because we have to do all of the scientific analysis to prove whether or not these are his remains or not. And people really were hanging on to the genetic evidence. So I take the DNA from the skeleton, I compare it against known relatives, and I'm looking for a match. The pressure was just amazing. It was just, what's the DNA telling us? And as a geneticist, I'm the first person to tell you it has to be taken in context. We have to take it in the fact we find him in the right place. He's looking like he's about the right age. He's got battle injuries. He's got severe scoliosis of the spine. And then the DNA matches as well. So I'm the first person to tell you DNA has to be taken in context.
I like the closing line of your book. DNA is the story of us all. We now have the power to shape where that story goes and must learn to wield that power wisely. I hope through this that we will learn how important it is, but also just how to wield that power wisely in the world of science. Turi, it's always a joy talking to you. Professor Turi King, author of The Secrets of Our DNA, How Genetics Has Changed the World.